All right, let's check out some of the equipment that made the recording arts industry a possibility in the time period we're considering. Of course, you have to imagine you've got all of these heritage music performance instruments, such as the piano, the harpsichord, the cello, the viola, French horn, on down the line. So that's, the piano. I guess I probably mentioned that. That's all in place. Um, but we see a sort of uptick in terms of innovation that circulates around the idea that sound can be captured. That was completely unheard of. And then what do you do with those recordings, right? So the distribution of them, the optimization of them, and the enhancement of the live performance when it starts to become synchronized with a visual aspect. You know, dramatic theater, of course, has been around since the days of at least the Greeks and probably before. Um, but we see a different horizon of expectation when you've got film, for example, as part of the deal. So one of the first things we find in terms of, and so this is, the combination of sound and image, is this really cool thing called the magic lantern, which is in fact a lantern that glows very brightly depending on what kind of wick or fuse you have in there. They experimented with different kinds of elements and materials that would burn like a candle but much brighter. And then you can see that you slot in these, it's kind of like stained glass, right? So these are slides that go in, and then the image comes out there. So here's your collection of slides. Here's the lantern and the carrying case. And this is like the chimney for whatever's burning in there. So you've got a little oven door that opens up. I mean, this is like hardcore retro. Here is an entire 13-minute video that you can enjoy and learn if this is something that's interesting to you about the magic lantern in particular. Also, so that would be, late 1800s. You've got people, in the magic lantern situation, you've got people that would gather in like the parlor of an upper class home. And you could have storytelling that goes along with this, but you could also have musicians off to the side to really have a great, event and audio visual spectacle. So this is late 1800s. Really interesting idea here. All right, so we also have the piano roll. The player piano is a piano that requires no human being to do anything else than kind of load the roll in there and press go. So this is one style that actually has raised indentations, so metal that's shot through this thick paper, and it circulates around. So these gears turn this roll around, and then as the metal comes in contact with these pins, it forces them to raise up, which then will trigger the sound to come out of the piano. So here's an entire composition, a song with these, longer notes or just shorter notes. It's probably, a half note or a whole note, and here you've got like a 16th, for example, for those of you who read musical notation. And so the piano roll situation was such that you had the government really had to step in because the Aeolian Company, who was a piano roll manufacturer, had exclusive deals with all of the music publishers, and the government had to come in and say, there can be no, because you have a monopoly here. There's no other piano roll companies. This is like the predecessor to the record company, right? They've got recordings that are physical, kind of like a vinyl album. And the government stepped in and said, this is unfair because there can be no other record company, or in this case, piano roll companies. And so they created what's referred to as the Compulsory Mechanical License in 1909 that says if, once there is a duplication of a song that's by making a piano roll, it can no longer be exclusive. So once it's been done once by Aeolian, then any other company can come in and also have a copy made without having to ask permission to do so, but they have to pay like the maximum mechanical royalty to do that. So you can learn more about that, of course, in the publishing and licensing class. But there is a story behind this, and it did change the 1909, or it did prompt the government to sort of change the playing ground, the playing field for music business companies in the 1909 copyright law. Okay, so when you are now looking at film and music, so this is an entire room, basically. You see a door back here that is behind the screen. So this is a movie theater on the right-hand side. So here are your folks sitting down, and here's a guy that's at the keyboard, which is triggering all of these sounds, right? And so you've got air pressure, so compressed air back here, that goes feeds all of these pipes, and you've got pulleys, and so spinning, belts and gears that are allowing this guy to press a key and then have like a giant metal ball that falls down onto a really, really tight trampoline that creates the sound of an exploding cannon or some kind of an explosion. Here you've got a tumbling bin that may have glass or small pellets in it that sounds like rain, thunder over here, a rifle firing. So you can see all of these things, a bell ringing. So all of this is triggered similar to the way that a piano roll works, but on a much larger scale for a theatrical performance. Okay, so let's look a little bit at radio. Here is a recording studio in 1930, so obviously after electricity. We have a single microphone which is suspended about here, and then maybe another microphone back here. So these folks are positioned at a distance because they don't have their own microphone. So the lead actors will be closest and their voices will be loudest. And then you've got other people who may be secondary actors at a little bit greater distance. And then you have the Foley folks back here who are either reading or making sounds to, create the theater of the imagination, as it's called. So, yes, was the radio industry boosted or depleted by the Great Depression? Well, the Great Depression, end of the 20s, beginning of the 30s, basically made it so if your entertainment wasn't free, you weren't going to be doing much of it. And so obviously radio boosted entertainment. These are a couple of early devices. And so you've got also, other media forms like live ticketed events, of course, had a downturn during the Great Depression. Records were not really in competition. The record companies thought that the radio feared, I guess, that the radio would be a competition and drive customers away, when in fact it was a great partnership. In other words, the record companies now had a distribution platform that can play their recordings over the air. So you've got Marconi as the principal inventor here. The first radio stations in 1920, WJ, WJZ, and KDKA in 1920. Interesting note, the K typically represents that a radio station is west of the Mississippi, and if it starts with a W, it's east of the Mississippi. WJZ presented a vaudeville show, the first vaudeville show on the radio in 1921, so you're seeing these kind of overlaps. So we talked about Leon Scott as the predecessor, the French predecessor to Thomas Edison, who developed the first recording. So he's actually the first to record sound, even though Edison gets the credit at least in our country. But in fact, he was a couple decades late to the game. His machine ultimately sounded much better than Leon Scott's. But you're seeing 1854 is much earlier. So here's what it looked like. You've got a sled of sorts, right? So a roll with a sheet sort of gathered on the roll. And the sound, whatever it is, someone shouting into it, is condensed down to the smaller point. It comes in very large, and so you've got an increase of air pressure in the smaller point, and then simply a needle that's suspended over what would be like a piece of rubber or something that would translate that energy and focus it and inscribe it onto whatever the material was. Now that's the difference between Scott and Edison. Edison was inscribing into metal, and Scott was inscribing into paper that had been coated with ash or smoke residue. So of course the tinfoil ended up doing much better, and that's where you get the metal masters in the video that we'll see in a minute, which is not Count Basie, but Duke Ellington recording in the studio, and what the recording process looked like in the 30s. So when you think about Bristol in the late 20s, this is an on-location recording studio, which is basically a giant horn hung by a rope that is passing through on this end. So it's capturing the sound once again, condensing it down to a finer point, and then that's passing through into a separate room where the mechanical recording is taking place. This is pre-electricity in many cases. And so here's your recording stylus. The tube comes in down to this point and then into here, and then is recording into some sort of material. Really, it depends on the era. And then here's your early player. So the record players were in this period were not discs, but they were cylinders. So you do not have a flat platter like you find in modern vinyl records, but instead a cylinder that fits over here. You wind this thing up, and it's the reverse of how it was recorded, right? So the needle rests on the surface and plays and moves side to side as it goes, and then spits the sound out of this thing, which gets louder as it gets bigger, as opposed to getting quieter but more concentrated as you get into the smaller place, the smaller end of the horn. And so here's another picture of a recording studio that uses this horn technique. Once again, just like with single microphone, which this is basically acting as a microphone, it's proximity, which means how big, louder or quiet you are in the mix. So the louder musicians like drums and piano would be in the distance, and the horns would be in the distance, and the quieter musicians or lead musicians would be a bit closer. And then here you go. Here's what's on the other side of the wall. You've got the sound from the horn passing into this small point and then being inscribed. In this case, this would be onto a platter. So this is a little bit later. This is 25. The cylinders were out by, I would say the early 1900s. Late 1800s, early 1900s, the cylinders had phased out and turned into the record disc that we expect today. By the 1930s, you've got innovations such as a microphone instead of this giant horn that's hanging out. You've got electron tubes, which are acting to amplify the signal, and so now you're dealing with an electrical recording device, and so this would be a field recording device, and all of this would take the place of this entire contraption that we see, the huge horn and the this kind of large, complicated, cumbersome device. And so you can see we're already moving into the idea of smaller being better. Okay, this is the video, the Duke Ellington video about how we make records. In the 1930s, and so just watch this if you're interested in that. When it comes to you know, instrumentation, and this is one of the most interesting bits because we're moving, of course, to the debut of the electric guitar in the late 40s. But before that, guitarists, of course, had to hang out with much louder instruments. And so, how did they do that? And one way was the resonator guitar. And so, this is actually a resonator mandolin here, but it's a metal body. So, you think of what's louder, right? Wood versus metal. You clank on a piece of wood, it's going to make some noise, but you hit a piece of metal, it's going to make a louder noise. And so, a metal body was louder, and then you've got this resonating plate here, which would be a way to further amplify the sound. And so this is getting the guitar to the point where it can kind of hang in an ensemble, say a kind of early jazz band, pre-electric, so 1920s up until the first half of the 1930s. And so, who's going to be the lead instrument was usually the loudest of the instruments. And so that's why we don't have lead guitar showing up until we've got something electrical going on. Or we have a very small recording format, like maybe a trio or a duo. And you've got a vocalist and maybe a fiddle player and then a guitar player who has one of these metal-bodied guitars. Could be the featured instrument. And so this metal body, you've got the guitar, mandolin, and banjo all with this resonating metal, resonating metal technology that would allow them, for these instruments, which are traditionally quieter than the trumpet and the fiddle, to compensate and to be able to hang with those other ones. So once again, this is leading us to some what we'll look at next week, which is, of course, the incredible impact of the guitar changing from an accompaniment instrument that's struggling to find its place to a spotlight instrument. And of course, that's going to be done by virtue of electricity, and in particular, the electric guitar. Here we have a lap steel, which is one of the first instruments that was electrified. A pedal steel. This is a pedal steel. This is a lap steel on the bottom. So you put it across your lap, and now you've got a cable to plug into an amplifier. These three amplifiers, or this family developed by Gibson, was a rebranding of the Rickenbacker Electro. So in 1933, that's really the very first instance, and this thing looks like a somewhere between an anvil and a lunchbox. The Electro does. These are it's just a black box, very heavy, with a speaker and some tubes in it. And so this is Alvino Rey, who was the first amplified guitar player, but he once again did more of a pedal steel situation. And it was, a novelty. People didn't really take it seriously until you start to get to some of the players, like Charlie Christian in particular, who had the platform of Benny Goodman's band and also playing at Carnegie, and so it was blowing people's minds to hear what a guitar could do. And so Gibson basically took the Electro design and rebranded it, and made some innovative sort of updates to it, and you get to these. This is the EH series. And so this is bringing us into the 1940s. A lot of the elements that end up resulting in, quote, the music business that, rock and roll, for example, so louder, more aggressive, more spectacular. You can see these coming together here. And so stay tuned, because the class is about to change into high gear.